On this episode of What the Ship, we look at the top 5 maritime stories as of January 12th, 2025. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. A lot to look at today. We're going to do some updates and then jump into our stories. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. On Friday, January 10th, a tanker, the Eventin, Panamanian flag, 274 meters outbound of the Baltic, broke down coming into the Danish Strait. The vessel lost power, actually crossed the vessel traffic separation scheme. The ship was loaded with 99,000 tons of oil, 24 crew members on board. A German emergency towing vessel, the Bremen Fighter, came out and was able to lasso the vessel and pull it into a safe anchorage. The ship is believed to be part of the Russian Shadow or Parallel Fleet, although in this case, this ship does have a pretty legit registry. The ownership company is in the UAE. It has a classification agency, DNV, where it is listed, and it actually is holding insurance through the West London P&I Group. So obviously a tanker involved in the transport of Russian oil, but not quite as dark as a vessel like the Eagle S, which we're going to talk about. Over in the port of Philadelphia, we were talking about Algoma Verity. This vessel grounded the other day coming up the Delaware River. You'll notice the ship has a pronounced list to starboard. That's because the U.S. Coast Guard, in a press briefing, noted that 4 of the ship's ballast tanks and 1 empty fuel tank had all been ruptured, leading to the ship listing to starboard. When the winds died down, high tide came in, they were able to pull the vessel off the embankment. It is now docked in the port of Philadelphia, undergoing repairs and inspections. Over in the Baltic, we have several stories regarding the Eagle S. The anchor from the vessel has been recovered. The investigation has shown that the anchor was dragged over 60 miles. You can see the damage that was done to this anchor. This is an 11-ton anchor, 4 meters in length, 2.5 meters in width. You'll notice that part of the anchor is literally gone. The flukes have been either broken or rubbed off. No paint at all on this anchor. Also note that the Finnish authorities conducted a safety inspection on board the vessel. Under the International Maritime Organization, countries have the right to do what's called port state control. Well, the port state control inspection of Eagle S discovered 32 deficiencies, including 4 that prevent the vessel from sailing. So the vessel is being held in Finland until work can be done to alleviate the issues. However, I think the ship is eventually going to be arrested because of damage to the pipelines and cables. There is no telling the amount of damage this vessel caused by dragging an 11-ton anchor across 60 miles of the bottom of the Baltic Sea. Another story we have discussed is the plight of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. These are the auxiliary vessels of the Royal Navy that are crewed by merchant mariners. You may remember they were protesting the fact that they had not received a pay raise. However, that has been resolved after 100 days of action short of strike. I should note, it wasn't a full strike. The vessels still sailed. They still operated. However, they were not going above and beyond that duty. The reason for the strike originated with the offer for a pay raise. They were only offered a 4.5 pay increase. However, since 2010, the last time they have received a pay raise, their overall earning potential has decreased by 30%. The last story deals with the potential strike that was going to occur on the East and Gulf Coast. As you know, that strike has been averted. An agreement has been hashed out between the ILA and the U.S. Maritime Alliance. The end result of that is we're seeing the repeal of certain surcharges that were going to be levied by shipping companies. The other thing we're starting to see is that the East Coast shipping rates are expected to start cooling down. That may see a resurgence in cargo heading back to the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. We have seen cargo shifting over to the West Coast, but now we can expect to see a major readjustment in cargo. Plus, we're seeing a lot of cargo heading our way right now because of the upcoming Chinese New Year and because of potential tariffs from the Trump administration. All right, let's go ahead and jump into story number 2. This story deals with Russian tankers and renewed further sanctions against the Russian oil tanker fleet. The story over at GCAP: U.S. blocks more than 180 vessels, oil traders, and companies in sweeping new sanctions against Russia. The measure blocks two major Russian oil producers, Gazprom Neft and Surgutneftgaz. I know I probably pronounced that wrong. My apologies to all our Russians watching the show. The country's largest shipping operator, Sovcomflot. The sanction targeted 69 vessels owned by Sovcomflot, including 54 oil and product tankers and 4 LNG tankers. Unprecedented in scope, the latest sanctions target more than 180 oil and gas-carrying vessels, including those part of the Russia's shadow fleet. The list of newly sanctioned vessels include 4 LNG carriers. The most notable on there is the Christophe Dumogery. That is an LNG ice-capable vessel, really one of the prizes of the Russian oil petroleum fleet. Stories continue. Biden's sweeping sanctions target the Russia's oil exports as Trump prepares for office. There's a lot of belief that Biden is doing a lot of these actions in anticipation that Trump will not be as harsh and as retaliatory against the Russians for their actions. Then you have this story over at Bloomberg. Russia's crude shipments tumbled to the lowest in 16 months. This is the lowest level since August of 2023. We had a peak back in October at 540,000 barrels a day. The drop in shipments over the 2.5-month period has been concentrated at ports in western Russia and was accentuated by a decline in the number of cargoes leaving Ust-Luga since mid-November. This is the major port on the Baltic. On the flip side, we have seen crude oil increase coming out of the Russian Pacific ports, which saw record shipments of 993 barrels a day last month. Again, it could be issues involving the Baltic states wanting to stop and inspect vessels going out. The Russians may not want to have their ships bottled up in the Baltic, since many of those vessels would not be able to pass a inspection being done for port state control or show that they have insurance. This story from Reuters: global crude exports dipped in 2024 as trade routes reshuffled again. The volume of global crude exports in 2024 declined 2%, the first fall since the COVID pandemic. Goes on, these shifts have become more pronounced as oil refineries have shut in Europe amid continued attacks on Red Sea shipping. Middle Eastern crude exports to Europe tumbled 22% in 2024, as ship tracking data from researcher Kepler showed. It goes on, oil is no longer flowing along the least cost curve, and the first consequence is tight shipping, which raises freight prices and eventually cuts into refining margins. The U.S., with its surging shale production, has been a winner in the global oil trade. The country exports 4 million barrels per day, very little of that on U.S. tonnage, I might add, boosting its share of global oil trade to 9.5% behind Saudi Arabia and Russia. In 2025, suppliers will keep grappling with falling fuel demand in major consuming centers such as China. Also, more countries will use less oil and more gas, while renewable energy will keep growing. The story goes on, talks about the fact that we're seeing new suppliers and new routes develop. A lot of this has to do with the Houthi attacks that is forcing shipping to go around Africa, and more importantly, to find new routes. We're seeing exports declining from countries like Iraq and from the United Arab Emirates. Meanwhile, we're seeing the expansion of new refineries and pipelines. Not a lot of new refinery being built, for example, in the United States. So instead, what we're seeing is refining increasing in developing economies. So Nigeria, for example, has seen its output increased. We're seeing new refining capacity in countries like Bahrain, Oman, and Iraq. And in Canada, the expanded Trans Mountain Pipeline can now ship an extra 590,000 barrels per day to the Pacific Coast. That has a ripple effect, so the Canadian crude flowing to the West Coast, refineries in the region bought less Saudi Arabian and Latin American crude, while direct shipments from Canada to Asian countries have cut re-exports from the U.S. Gulf Coast. All of this plays a role in moving cargo around. At the same time, U.S. tanker stocks surge after the Pentagon blacklisted major Chinese maritime players. We're going to come back to this. But shipping companies like OSG, for example, had saw a massive spike in their stock prices. The story notes that leading tanker operators Frontline saw the most dramatic gains, with shares climbing 10.3%. Scorpio Tankers at 9.7, TK, International Seaways, DHT, and North American Tankers all ended up the day between 6 and 7%. And in another interesting move, I don't have the full story up here, but Reuters reported that China's Shandong Port Group issued a notice on Monday banning U.S. sanctioned oil vessels from its port, according to 3 traders. So these are vessels of the Russian shadow fleet that have been identified under the U.S. Office of Foreign Asset Control. This is really one of the first times we've seen China jump in on following a sanction set by the United States. Implications for that are really unknown. We're not exactly sure how that plays out. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to story number 3. So we talked about Russia. Let's talk about China now. This story out on GCAP by Bloomberg, China's biggest shipping line added to the U.S. military blacklist. The U.S. has blacklisted 2 shipbuilders over alleged links with the People's Liberation Army as Washington turns its attention to the country's massive maritime sector. COSCO Shipping Holding Company was named in the Federal Register filing on Tuesday, qualifying it as a Chinese military company as determined by the Pentagon, along with China State Shipbuilding Corporation and China Shipbuilding Trading Company. While the blacklist carries no specific penalties, it discourages U.S. firms from dealing with those companies. This is a pretty big move. COSCO, the Chinese Overseas Shipping Company, and the Chinese State Shipbuilding Corporation are 2 of the biggest in terms of maritime. COSCO is about the 4th largest container liner in the world, but it is individually the largest shipping line in the world because it has multiple assets. It has heavy lift, it has tankers, it has roughly over 1,400 ships under its control. The Chinese State Shipbuilding Corporation builds by itself, the CSSC, builds over 20% of the world ships, not just China's, the world ships. Remember, China right now on its order books has over 60% of world shipping. So this is a big move. Now, it contains no actual issues regarding whether or not ships can come in. COSCO ships are dockside right now in the United States offloading. But then you have this story. China-linked ship owner denies Taiwan accusation of damaging the undersea cable. So this is the vessel Shenzhen 39. It was accused by Taiwan of cutting a cable connecting Taiwan, very similar to what we've seen happening in the Baltic with ships like Nunu Polar Bear, with Yiping 3, and now with Eagle S. The question is China developing a similar strategy here with Taiwan? Taiwan is linked by numerous cables to the outside. It is largely believed that this would be part of a campaign to kind of isolate Taiwan. The Taiwanese Coast Guard is responding to these, doing more monitoring of their coast to watch this. However, Taiwanese cables are extremely exposed because of their length and the fact that they're all obviously not in Taiwanese waters. They go out into international waters. Then we have this story. Iran's oil exports soar to 587 million barrels, led by China's thirst. This marks an increase of 10.75% up from last year, according to United Against Nuclear Iran. We know the Iranians have been doing a lot of exporting under their sanctions. They have been restricted in where they can go because of these U.S. sanctions. We are not sure how the Trump administration is going to deal with Iran. Are they going to level more sanctions against them? But one of the things we are seeing is Iran is getting its oil out, and largely to countries like China, who has a need for it. We are seeing a global shift of how oil moves around the planet, with the United States entering in the arena here, being a massive exporter, with the diversions being caused by the Houthi and a whole series of other geopolitical issues. We're seeing the idea of free movement of goods around the planet being jeopardized, and that has an impact on commodities, on petroleum, and a whole variety of other materials. All right, let's go ahead to our 4th story. Story number 4 takes us to the Red Sea and a discussion about issues regarding our favorite friends, the Houthi. A fantastic story that's going to be a separate video at some point. I just need to get to it. Was this story by Richard Mead over at Lloyd's List, how the Sun Union salvage exposed a fundamental gap in shipping crisis response capabilities. Towing a burning tanker through a high-risk area of naval conflict was technically complex, but the diplomatic hurdles behind the scenes was equally challenging. Richard Meade has put together a fantastic piece with great imagery also showing this. You may remember Soyunion was the tanker that was targeted by the Houthi. They actually boarded the vessel on 2 separate occasions. They detonated charges on board. This is the burnt out bridge where they went on board after the second time. The vessel was set on fire, burning from its hatches and holds, and was adrift for a long, protracted period of time. We're talking about weeks that this vessel burned. An effort was put together by insurance companies led by Ambrey and a few others to get the vessel away from the coast of Yemen, tow it up to Suez to eventually extinguish the fires and conduct the salvage of the ship. One of the things that needs to be highlighted here is that navies, particularly the U.S. Navy for a long time, had a very extensive salvage capability. They had firefighting salvage vessels, they had fleet tugs, they had a myriad of these. The U.S. Navy is down to only 2 salvage vessels today. They're building a class of 12 of these, but they're nowhere near being completed yet, and that leaves the navies with a shortage. This is why you want naval salvage vessels, because they can go into areas where there's such high risk. This is important not just for commercial shipping, but for military. When the navies get involved in potential wars, you want those type of capabilities to go in and pull vessels out. You can look at World War II, for example, numerous occasions where the U.S. Navy was lacking that capability and they lost vessels. The USS Hornet, for example, at Santa Cruz. Whereas later on in the war, where you see the attacks off of Formosa, Taiwan, you can see 2 U.S. cruisers, Canberra and Houston, were saved because you had salvage tugs in the area. This is going to be a really interesting story. I'm looking forward to breaking that one down and going and pulling that thread on it a little more. The other stories regarding the Red Sea are this. Wartime risk insurers making fortunes, keeping the trade moving. There's a lot of money being made over the war risk. Remember, we're looking at a war risk insurance right now of probably anywhere from 0.5% up to maybe a little bit more than 1% for ships transiting through this region. Every ship going through has got to pay that. And the payout right now has been minimal. We've had 2 ships sunk, several ships damaged. Soyunion's a good example of that. Soyunion's probably the most damaged we've seen. But the large number of ships, 60% of the normal traffic, is still heading through the region, yet insurance collectors are collecting a lot of money. And so if you're a war risk underwriter, man, you're making some good money. In the meantime, the United States and Israel have upped their attacks against the Houthis. Oil tanker backup near Yemeni port after Israelis hit tugs. The Israelis have been much more strategic in their targeting of the Houthi. They are going after infrastructure. The United States strikes being centered off the carrier Truman, which is located in the Red Sea right now, tend to be retaliatory. In other words, they're striking missile launches and sites that have direct impacts. The Israelis have no compulsion here because they have been struck by missiles launched by the Houthi, so they're going for the infrastructure, meaning they're targeting the ability of the Houthi to bring vessels in and out of the area, and that is, of course, prompting comments by the Houthi. They're out there in force discussing this. And if I could just say for one note, I think Sari here is overcompensating with his microphones. I'm just saying, 1 microphone, 2 microphones is enough. That is pure microphone envy right there. I mean, I just have the 1 microphone, but Sari there seems to want more microphones to kind of, I don't know, make himself feel better. They could be also a shield to prevent him from being hit from drones and missiles and bombs being launched by the Israelis and the Americans. I hope you didn't get those microphones from the Israelis, because the Israelis have a tendency to, make things go boom. All right, let's go ahead to our last story. Our last story deals with the incoming Trump administration. We're getting ready for inauguration, the phase out of President Biden, 46th president of the United States, President Trump coming in as the 47th president of the United States, first non-consecutive president since Grover Cleveland. That's right. If you've been in any bar Trivial Pursuit, that's one of those questions that tends to come up. The Trump administration has announced a lot of issues regarding maritime. We've just had the announcement of the SHIPS Act, did a whole video on that, but the Trump administration has, ratcheted this up to 11. So in a recent press conference, President-elect Trump noted that he refuses to rule out military force to retake Panama Canal from China control. I'm going to be doing one of my Shipping 101 episodes, the third one that'll come out next week, which deals specifically with the Panama Canal and goes through this. Suffice it to say this: the United States had brokered a treaty with Panama and was able to get the agreement to build the canal initially. It was initially with Colombia, and then it was with Panama. There's a story behind that I will share with you. The canal was to be in perpetuity to the United States. 1977, President Carter, who just died, made a treaty which was ratified through the U.S. Senate to hand over the control of the canal by 1999, which was done. And the Panama Canal is essential to the U.S. American economy. The largest movement of goods through the Panama Canal is for the United States. Second is China. And so there's a lot of issues. The Panama Canal is under the authority of the Panama Maritime Authority, the PMA. They control it. It's not controlled by China. However, China does have interest in the ports on both ends of the canal and some issue in mining and operations of some facets in and around Panama. So there are issues that need to be explored. Now, whether or not the U.S. should military seize the canal is a whole different issue. Right now, the canal is operating as we expect. It is moving ships through. We just saw a resumption back to normal operations with the Gatun Lake getting back to full level. We're seeing the required 36 ships basically a day going through, and we're back to no restrictions on draft going through. So President Trump is obviously making an issue here about the vitality of the Panama Canal, which I agree. But again, I'll be going in more detail on that on that Shipping 101 episode. But it's definitely something to watch, because then you have this story out on President Trump. Trump looks to Greenland to cement his legacy and expand the sphere of U.S. influence. The story goes on. Denmark has responded to Trump's comments by saying Greenland is not for sale. Denmark has controlled Greenland for hundreds of years, although its 57,000 people now govern their own domestic affairs. The way to think about Greenland and Denmark is they're kind of federated together. There's Denmark, there's the Faroe Islands, which is north of Great Britain, and basically between Great Britain and Iceland, and then there's Greenland. And basically Denmark's claim to Greenland goes back to the Vikings. Greenland was occupied by the United States in April of 1941 during World War II. We wanted to destroy some German weather stations that were up in that area. We have a major presence in Greenland up at the Air Force Base at Thule. It was part of the old Distant Early Warning Network. There's still a major radar post there to monitor Russia from nuclear launches. So the U.S. does have an interest in Greenland for a long time. The issue with Greenland is really a couple. Number one, it is, as the Arctic routes open up, it has the potential to give access to it, although the Canadians have said that the Northwest Passage is not going to be open. This Greenland is really not near the Russian Northern Sea route. Second, mineral issues in Greenland. It's believed that Greenland is one of the greatest sources of rare earth minerals. And then one of the things not thought about very much, but it should be, is that Greenland possesses a good chunk of the world's fresh water in the ice cap that is on Greenland itself. Now, the United States has bought territory from Greenland, from Denmark in the past. 1917, we bought the Virgin Islands. Why? Because of the opening of the Panama Canal. It's a weird symbiotic relationship between the two here. So Greenland would be an issue. There would be an issue if we obtain Greenland over the Jones Act because of coastal trade. Would Greenland be included in the Jones Act? The Virgin Islands were not, as a matter of fact. So there are, precedent for exempting Greenland from that. I think it's interesting. I'm not going to go that it's the craziest deal in the world, because, again, crazy deals happen all the time. They said that about Jefferson in the Louisiana Purchase. He was going out to buy New Orleans, and then Napoleon sold him everything. There's all a question here about growth. But the issue underlying both the Panama Canal and Greenland is this: there is more attention being focused on maritime issues than at any time in my lifetime. I can say that. We have really never seen the U.S. as cognizant of how important ocean and trade are. Panama Canal is a vital, vital choke point. Greenland is astride another potential choke point heading up into the Arctic. That's why a lot of attention is being focused right now on Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, Nome, the Bering Sea and the Bering Strait. A lot of attention being devoted to it. This is not as crazy as some people think it is. It's a little crazy. I mean, to buy Greenland, the last time we bought anything and made anything a state was 1959 when we brought Alaska and then Hawaii in. It's been a long time. The flags haven't changed. I should note that if you do add a state to the flag, little known, flags have to be made in the United States. Great business for flag makers. If you add a 51st state and you got to change every flag in the United States, huge business for flags. Buy some flag stock. I'm not sure what flag stock is. I'm not sure what are the big companies that build flags, but probably something we need to be looking at. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, give it a big thumbs up, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that, Sal? Well, you hit the super thanks button there. You can contribute directly to the page, or head on over to Patreon. You'll see the icon come up here, or actually over here, and you'll see it down below. Until our next episode, Sal, signing off.